Good evening, folks. My name is Sarah Graham. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Communications and Advocacy Manager here at the YWCA National Capital Area. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Black History Month event, which is all in the fight for democracy. And it's going to be a film discussion. So it's an election year, as we all know, and all voices need to be heard at the ballot box. And our question is, but will they? And we want to talk about it. So tonight we are joined by Dr. Ida Jones, who is an American historian and author, and is also the University Archivist at Morgan State University. And her and I are going to have a little one-on-one discussion about the history of Black voting rights and voter suppression here in this country. So we do hope you had a chance to view and watch the film, All In, the Fight for Democracy, but don't worry if you didn't. We'll be showing a few clips from the film to kind of help frame our discussion this evening. If you haven't joined us before, conversation will run about an hour at the most, with about 30-45 minutes of discussion, and then some time at the end to have a Q&A. And just a few quick reminders, as always, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know what you hope to learn today. And if you have any questions as we go along, please share those in the chat and we'll try to hopefully address a few of them at the end. And I muted all the lines for now, but at the end you'll be able to come off mute or come on camera, whatever makes you most comfortable to ask your question. And as always, we are a 501c3 organization, so all the resources and conversation here today will be nonpartisan. Want to pass the torch to our CEO, Monica Gray, for a quick little intro.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Sarah said, this is our Black History Month event. It's part of our ongoing series called Courageous Conversations, which really addresses a variety of issues in race and justice. And this month for Black History, we're speaking about voting rights and the role of African Americans, particularly African American women, in the fight for democracy and the fight for the right to vote. As we have shared with you for the past couple of years, and certainly at the beginning of this year, we will be leaning very heavily into voter rights activities throughout the year. As everyone knows, we have a major off presidential cycle election year, but a major election year nonetheless. And as we have all watched over the course of the last many years, but particularly the last several years, there has been an all-out effort to undermine the right to vote in this country. And in particular, the last few years, where we've seen people somewhat to their thinking cleverly, use the global international health crisis of a pandemic to slowly, and they think secretly, erode voter rights in this country. And we are among those paying attention and those who are trying to sound the alarm for as many people as possible. The sad reality is that many Americans don't realize just to what extent the erosion of voting rights have taken place over the last couple of years and certainly the last several decades. And so it is our goal this year to make sure that we use our platform and our voice to make sure that people are aware at the local and state level so that they can push back both in the way they cast their votes for the leaders who make changes to the legislation that impacts elections, as well as in the way they make the decision to cast their vote and who they choose to represent them. And so we thank all of you for joining us, and we are particularly excited to have Dr. Jones with us because she will share with us not just the perspective of what we have going on today, but how it ties into sort of the long and challenged history of voting rights in this country, who got to vote, who was thought to have the right to vote, and how we got to the point where we are now, and how we got to the point where we were when voting rights were most protected. And so we thank you for joining us, Dr. Jones, and we thank everyone else for joining us as well. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Monica. Dr. Jones, if you'd like to give a little intro about yourself for the folks here, and then we'll watch a quick film clip.
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Monica, Sarah, and the YWCA of Greater Washington. I'm excited about this because our centennial year of 2020 was hijacked partially by the pandemic, which is a very interesting metaphor for how women in general had to struggle for the right to vote. As mentioned, I am a historian and an archivist at Morgan State University, but I have a larger interest in African American women's history, having been the national director of the Association of Black Women Historians. And I was also, or actually also am a member of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. So I work in Maryland, but I live in DC, and it's all called the DMV anyway. But nevertheless, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center has done an outstanding job with documenting suffrage throughout the state of Maryland. In partnership with the National Collaboration for Women's History Sites, I'm on the board for them as well. And they were looking at doing a map online, an interactive map online of suffrage sites around the country. And the Pomeroy Foundation joined with the National Collaborative to really create markers, historical markers that will go in the ground, that will chronicle local history sites of suffrage. So as the DC state coordinator, wearing many, many hats, almost like a Zeus character, Dr. Seuss, but at any rate, I'm the DC historical markers person. So we'll have 4 markers going up around the city, principally in Northwest Washington, DC, that will chronicle the contributions of local women, some names known, some names not known, that really helped the national movement. At the old M Street School at 128 M Street Northwest, that is the oldest African-American first public high school. It was called the old M Street School, it's now Dunbar High School. Nanny Helen Burroughs, a prominent African-American woman and suffragist and Christian woman, really crusaded to bring Baptist women into the fold. Then we have at the corner of 16th and R Street Northwest, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is the longest serving organization founded in 1896 that crusaded for equality for all women, as well as suffrage. And then just down the corner on 17th and New Hampshire Avenue is the national headquarters of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, that was also crusading since 1913 as their first public act to participate in the parade that was the national parade to kind of protest the idea of women's suffrage. And then the last most holy place, Howard University, my alma mater, will also be participating at the house of Mary Church Terrell, who served as the first national president of the NACWC, was a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and all things amazing in terms of her work to set up equality for women. So just in brief, the women's suffrage movement spans a 78-year interracial, cross-national, multicultural effort by women of all stripes, ages, and kind to really push the needle in this country to vote. So women's suffrage had the longest crusade in this hemisphere to basically gain the right to vote. And in the midst of that, there were issues of fraught elements of race, class, gender, regionalism. So it wasn't a united fight, but it was also a fractured fight that has continued into the 21st century with bits of those fractures. So we'll have a conversation on tonight about this. And I'm very excited that we're able to revisit this because, like I said, 2020 was hijacked. So we hopefully will have conversation and galvanize ourselves across race, class, gender, breed, and orientation to ensure that we as American citizens have the right to exercise our democracy. So thank you.
Well, that's an intro. Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm really excited to have you in conversation today. I'm going to start with a really quick clip from the film. I'm going to cue that up now, and then we will move from there.
The United States is the only country that makes it so difficult for communities to own their power by requiring them to jump through hoops to simply participate in basic elections. It's pernicious because it convinces you that maybe it's not worth trying again. And when entire communities become convinced that the process is not for them, we lose their participation in our nation's future, and that's dangerous to everyone.
You cannot understand where we are right now unless you understand the history of voting rights and the struggle for voting rights. Past is prologue. Those forces that are systematically determined to keep American citizens from voting, they have been laying the seeds over time.
When we started as a country, it wasn't really anything like what we would consider a democracy. Only white men who owned property had the right to vote. That was a very small segment of the country even then.
The Constitution begins with the words, "we the people." And yet, who were the people? It doesn't include slaves. It doesn't include women. It doesn't include Native Americans. It doesn't include young people. So the notion of the people is very restricted.
You won't find sitting anywhere in the articles of the Constitution where it says American citizens have the right to vote. When you have the founders writing in the language of enlightenment, dealing with getting rid of monarchy and getting rid of kings and having this wonderful, beautiful republic. And then you have 6% who are eligible to vote. White, male property owners. It tells you we had a lot of work to do.
We do have a lot of work to do. And we're going to do some of that work
Hi,
here.
welcome back to Heimlich History.
Oh,
We've been working
one
through Unit 6 of
moment.
AP
Hold on.
World History.
I guess YouTube decided that we were going to learn a little bit about imperialism for a moment, but now we're back to voting rights. Dr. Jones, as we all know, voting rights aren't enshrined in the Constitution, and voter suppression isn't a new phenomenon. Can you tell us a little bit? I know you said a little bit about this in your intro, about the historical significance of Black women in this movement for voting rights.
Thank you. Great question. Just very briefly, the idea of voting, as she said, was principally for land-owning white men of a certain stature. So we fast forward from 1848, which is the Seneca Falls Convention, in which there was the Declaration of Sentiment, where women, white women in particular, Frederick Douglass was the only African-American to participate, where they used the same framework of the Declaration of Independence to declare the sentiments of wanting to be equal with men as American-born citizens. Then you have to fast forward to 1870, and that is when the 15th Amendment was being crafted. Now, there are 3 Civil War amendments, and you might play it in a clip, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th. The 13th abolishes slavery, the 14th establishes equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment now was going to give the franchise or the vote to everybody else. But they saw the idea of using that as a political football, Black men or white women. So it became very ugly in that era about the idea of giving it to, quote, Black men. Susan B. Anthony and all the other matrons of the women's movement really bared their teeth in racist rhetoric towards African-American men during that particular time. And that drove a wedge between Black women and white women during that time. The franchise was given to Black men, but not just Black men, because you heard other men. And white men who didn't own property and other ethnic minorities were allowed to vote in that effort. But they always want to paint it as the Black man who had the right to vote. And then, of course, they're electing themselves, they're representing themselves in government, but all other men were allowed to be included in the franchise. This was a slap in the face to women who had been the mothers and daughters of these men who had locked them out for the greater part of the republic. So they enter the 20th century in a fracture. There's going to be an American Women's League and a National Women's League, and they're going to have different opinions on how do we address this. Because what happens in this country, and this ties into voter suppression, what the states have done since the Civil War is called a nullification. Texas and Florida are very clear on this. There are state laws which they will then nullify federal laws, because we're a republic of states. But they say the federal government cannot abridge the rights of the state. So they use this language, and that's why I wanted to be a lawyer so much, that they can actually say, okay, we're a citizen of Texas, even though we're a member of the United States, but we're going to invalidate or nullify that federal law and impose our own laws. So the Women's Party decided to come together and both fight nationally and statewide, state by state, to actually have women enfranchised. The Western states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Wyoming were far more open to women voting because there were less citizens there, because they were full of Native American persons who were their own sovereign nations. So the West was far more radical. whereas the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast were far more restricted in terms of letting women vote. And then, of course, the Deep South didn't want anybody who didn't, quote, have pre-Civil War free persons in voting at all. So the country was very bifurcated, very fractured or balkanized, and those same states are living out that spirit of those ancestors. So if you look at African-American women who are what they call at intersectionality, they're at the nexus point of both African-Americans and women, two marginalized groups with very limited conversation. They held the greatest weight of this invisibility and this mute voice. So what they sought to do through the women's club movement is to galvanize themselves, to have voice for everybody. So when you find a Stacey Abrams able to galvanize, quote, the minority masses of Georgia, it's not because she's a Black woman, but she understands being marginalized as female and as a person of color. So then she becomes the voice for all of them, the LGBT as well, or the physically challenged as well. Because only people on the periphery can speak for other people on the periphery. Long answer.
No, I think it was the perfect amount of information, a lot, which I appreciate. In that same vein, what is like one thing that you think people just don't know about Black women's role in the suffrage movement?
That's a good question. I will try to abbreviate that. As I mentioned, the 4 monuments that we're going to have at the markers, and I'll gladly will share that information with you all when we get ready to launch them. But I think the idea is that the Black women have been in the movement since the 3 generations of it. So since 1848, African-American women have always had their interest in the idea of equality and suffrage. We talked briefly, you and I, pre-conversation about Frances Harper, who was a Maryland native and a poet, freeborn woman of color in 1825, who took the side of African-American men in that issue in 1870 and gave a very scathing review of how white women simply choose what's best for their own interests. So the relationship is transactional, not transformative. So she was very clear to make sure that they understood the relationship we have is to benefit you, not for the long benefit of myself. And so she is basically written out of the history and replaced by Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, who are contemporaries born in the 1820s as well, but as enslaved women in Maryland for one and New York in the other. And so as a result, she's muted and limited in the history of the 5-volume story of suffrage. Then we get to the 1890s, there's going to be at NACWC, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is going to be a matrix of Black women's clubs throughout the country who are going to galvanize on their own. So the names of these women and their participation over the long 78-year arc is also muted. And just an aside, as we look at a living vestige of the women's suffrage movement is the League of Women Voters. Once that organization was founded after the passage of the 9th Amendment, African-American women were allowed to participate, and they once again experienced that kind of transactional relationship, not transformative. So when they're pushing for anti-lynching bills, they're pushing for equity of pay for teachers, the League of Women Voters just simply said, well, that's your issue. That's a racial issue. That doesn't pertain to me and my issues. So as a result, the idea of kind of muting the voice of African-American women who are concerned with the larger equity of human rights, that relationship with white women and Black women becomes rather fractured over the course of the 20th century as well. They just had their first Black president of the League of Women Voters, national president, and she wrote a book about that. And I use that phrase from her. The relationships were transactional, not transformative. And that, I think, has been a lingering relationship between the different elements of the suffrage movement from an African-American perspective.
Took a note about transactional versus transformative when it comes to inclusion in movements. I think that can stand for a lot of movements throughout the history, if you will. Can you tell us a little bit about Black women's work to help get Black men the right to vote?
Yes, so we have Black men voting in the 1870s. They're doing a great job. As I said, I work in Baltimore, so I've done a little digging in Baltimore, and there was an effort in 1909 to kind of disenfranchise African-American men. It was the Baltimore women, school teachers in particular, who really kind of prodded physically, if not intellectually, their men to the polls. Because unlike the deeper southern states like Florida, where there was outright violence, literal violence, and actually in the same film you're talking about, or was it? Yeah, it was that film. People were murdered, literally just shot down, murdered, burned. I mean, really acts of true domestic terrorism. The women in Baltimore City made sure the men got to the polls and didn't sell their vote, because the idea of Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all these old cities had political bosses. So they would just buy blocks of votes I'll literally hand you cash and you go in there and push the lever for this person, or I'll buy you liquor. So the anti-saloon league was also very popular too. So the idea of abrogating your vote, not realizing that all of this, we just talked about, all politics are local. So whether it's about street lights, teachers' pay, commercial licenses, liquor licenses, everything we do is circumscribed by the law, and the law is legislated by the elected officials. So all of this will eventually impact your life. So selling your vote is literally selling your children down the river. So other white ethnic communities have the same issue, but African-American women in particular were concerned because of that double marginal jeopardy, female and Black. They had to ensure that the Black men would have the integrity and the gumption to think of the larger community, the children, the women, and the elderly. So that was very much a safeguard to kind of remind them, and Nannie Helen Burroughs does this very, very well. She is very vocal, she is very engaged, and she even really does prod and the kinds of, I don't say threaten, but really makes a very good argument for the case of the community on the voice of that one African-American male vote. So that was the idea, yes.
Oh, wonderful. You know, we've talked, this conversation in the beginning is really kind of about like the progress, the moving forward, the getting people's right to vote. But history tells us that with progress comes backlash. I think we are seeing that currently in states. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes with another clip from the film to talk a little bit about that. So one moment.
The first great protest march on the nation's capital ever was for the right to vote for women. In 1913, the day before the presidential inauguration, 5,000 women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. It took pushing and pushing and pushing. It took hunger strikes, picketing in front of the White House, all these creative nonviolent protests that was new to this country. This was before Gandhi had done a lot of these things, but the women's movement and the fight for women's suffrage introduced them to the United States.
We get to the 19th Amendment that guarantees women the right to vote.
When you look back at how long women fought for the right to vote, we're used to movements now 10 or 20 years and the change happens. Women spent their entire lifetimes fighting for the 19th Amendment.
Black women were instrumental in the passage of the 19th Amendment. They had been part of this conversation from its beginning. Women who were helping shape opportunity for white women and for Black men. And yet, in each of these conversations, Black women were left out of the narrative. And then post-Reconstruction, Black men who had suddenly become part of the body politic were once again disenfranchised.
The greatest moments of progress are followed by the most intense periods of retrenchment. That's what happened after the Civil War. Reconstruction was a high point for voting rights, and it was followed by nearly 100 years of Jim Crow.
The decision to remove the troops from the South was a decision made by one vote in the Congress. One vote put an end to Reconstruction and started the era of violence and bloodshed and Klan-led catastrophes.
The South was trying to figure out, how do we stop all of these Black folk from voting? If they continue to vote, we're in trouble. How do you say we don't want Black folks to vote without writing a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote? Mississippi said, oh, we've got this. We have figured out how to get around the 15th Amendment while systematically denying the vote to African Americans. and that was the Mississippi Plan of 1890. What Mississippi came up with was, we are going to use the societally imposed conditions on African Americans and make those conditions the access to the ballot box. What you say is, democracy is expensive. Elections are expensive. And if you're really invested, you should be willing to pay a small fee. A poll tax. It's not too much. It sounds so reasonable. But when you begin to think about what that means, you can pay for food or you can vote. You can pay for some clothes for your children or you can vote. And then the literacy test.
The literacy tests are misnamed in a sense because they weren't really tests of one's literacy. They were traps. They were designed to never let you be able to answer them correctly.
I actually took out one of the old literacy tests from Alabama. My class of second and third year law students could not pass the literacy test.
There were literacy tests, poll taxes.
Grandfather clauses, all white primaries, property clauses.
If this one doesn't get you, this one will. If this one doesn't get you, this one will.
There were this raft of different laws that were called the Black Codes. And those laws criminalized basic normal behavior. It was a crime to be on a city street without having a place to go. It was a crime not to have a job, even if what you were doing was looking for work. If you were caught loitering, meaning you were waiting for your wife in a store, that could be a pretext for arresting you, incarcerating you, and permanently disenfranchising you.
That felony disfranchisement coming out of Florida in 1868, what that does is it strips you of your right to vote. It is a way to neutralize the 15th Amendment.
Virtually overnight, African Americans are eliminated from the electorate in the South. So you go from having Black governors and senators to having almost no, if not any, Black voters that were able to participate in elections.
In Mississippi, during Reconstruction, African American voter registration was almost 67%. By the time we have fought the Nazis and we are moving into the Cold War, where the U.S. is really holding up as the leader of the free world, only 3% of age-eligible African Americans were registered to vote in the South. 3%.
That's a lot. I'd like you to provide a little bit of like context, especially some say unknown or often discussed historical facts kind of during this period of active voter suppression, obviously.
Yes, I think Carol Anderson does a great job of this, and she has several books out about this. But what we fail to realize in our culture of modernity that we all witnessed on January 6th of last January was that the violence is real for some people, and they have no problem inflicting that kind of pain, violence, or vigilante justice, as with the governor in Michigan. So I think in our modern sense, we can't really begin to imagine that people would actually murder or seek to what they call extra legal measures to disenfranchise people, but it happened. So one kind of passive case was Maryland. The 9th Amendment passes in 1920. Maryland did not ratify that till 1941 because they leaned in with Southern states to mute the voice of African-American women. So the idea of the ratification of the amendment didn't mean you couldn't vote in Maryland as a Black woman, but good luck trying to find a poll that would accept you. So they don't ratify that till 1941. They don't ratify that vote or certify that vote till 1958. So that's the state of Maryland. So when you go to someone like Florida, where Mrs. Bethune was, Mary McLeod Bethune was, the Klan actually marched on her campus to threaten the campus and the students that is now Bethune-Cookman University with physical violence. And so the idea is that because she was leading crusades for voting in that very fraught space, Florida is a very large state and it's trisected in terms of its ideological bent. All of it's towards the idea of muting the voices of persons they don't feel are citizens. But the actual violence got more towards the center in the southern part of the state versus the northeast corner where she had her school. But nevertheless, she said, go with bread without butter, or go with bread altogether, but pay your poll tax and vote. So those efforts were considered rather seditious to people who wanted to maintain the certain bedfellow of business and politics, which are in bed together. And those kinds of relationships, business and politics, really do have a very long-standing relationship in the case of this country. So then you have Fannie Lou Hamer. They just had a lovely documentary on her recently on PBS, talking about people losing their jobs because they went to register to vote. So the idea that the corporation or the company will fire you for exercising your civic duty really should not be a relationship to your employment, but they would use that as a threat as well. Also, the idea of just physical violence, shooting people's houses, threatening violence, attacking people, burning buses, all of this was done to cause fear, to once again thwart the vote and or force another migration. So some of this response of the violence during the first half of the 20th century resulted in the great migration of African Americans leaving by the millions from the deep South to the mid-Atlantic regions to California or the central parts of Detroit, Chicago, what have you. Those who chose to remain basically remained insulated in their own cultural spaces and legislated themselves accordingly. So they did not seek to cause any ruffles, and they basically had these bastions of Black oases within those spaces as best as possible. But then that's when you have Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. That's going to kind of be one of those fractures in the ceiling towards this, because if we're all citizens paying taxes towards a system called public education, why are the colored schools far less equipped, or the colored school students getting paid far less per head than they are for the white students? And the Black students would talk about, there's a school across the street, but I can't go there because it's an all white school. So I've got to take a bus and or walk 5 to 10 miles in the other direction. So all this comes from the idea of nullifying the voice of the federal government and then using physical violence and open terrorism to threaten and intimidate African Americans to exercise their right to vote. They still did it anyway. So the NAACP is going to be another point, a spear tip of this, to kind of force the issue of voting rights after they get the thing with education together, because it's all tied together. So the apportionments for students, teachers, and faculty are all tied into who's sitting in elected office. So all of this is one kind of circle, a concentric circles of connection.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to shift a little bit to talk about your work as an archivist. I think this audience will find it pretty fascinating. You know, documenting voting rights access and, you know, the voting rights movement is a very important part of maintaining an accurate historical record. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what your role in that.
Great question. For those who don't know, the archivist is the sister profession to libraries. So I always refer to us as the farmers and the restaurants. So the archivists are the farmers. We see the material in its raw form. So the photographs that you saw, the newspaper clippings you saw in the documentary, all come from an archival place. So those materials are no longer current, but they are important to our understanding intellectually of our history of our country. So archivists maintain those records that are no longer active or permanently valuable, while permanently valuable in their repositories. So the collections that you have, and being in Washington, D.C. with the Library of Congress and the National Archives, we are in kind of the center of the diadem, if we can say, in terms of the record keeping of the nation's history. But in the midst of all of that, those local histories that are in state and county archives or university or private collections also have voice to them. So there's one collection we have several collections at Morgan. One in particular is the Victorine Q. Adams papers. Now, Victorine Q. Adams was born in 1912 in Baltimore City and attended segregated schools her entire life. She graduates from Coppin Normal School, and Coppin now is Coppin State University. It was created by the state of Maryland to segregate African-American women who wanted to be teachers. You attended a 2-year certification program. And instead of integrating the system of the Maryland schools on the higher ed, they chose to create a separate school for colored women called Coppin Normal School. It became a university in 1967, but it was founded in 1902. She then goes to Morgan State College, which is now Morgan State University as well, to obtain her BS in education. So she does one of the 4 pink collar professions. She teaches. Nurses, social workers, librarians, and teachers were the 4 pink collar professions. In the classroom, these teachers really built the students up about their civic history, their race and sense of self, as well as the rudimentaries of English, math, science, and such. When they ratified the amendment in 1941 for African-American women to vote, she creates an organization called the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. So the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee in Baltimore City sought to get all African-American women familiar with the responsibility of the ballot. And she actually bought a voting machine, which is in the collection, to engage the physical machine so that you won't be tempted by those levers or pulling the levers or what have you. And it's a lovely relic that we have in the collection so people can actually see the hardware of mid-century, 20th century America. So the idea of educating and taking that same classroom instruction into the community, she also sought to create a guild for men. So there was the Minutemen, who were an auxiliary of this group, who went into male spaces, barbershops, saloons, and other places where men were, to help them understand their responsibility. And she was saying political education is not at ballot time. It is a 365, a consciousness of topics and conversations that get on the ballot. Because a lot of this could have been eradicated if we had basically had conversation prior to even getting to the level of being on the ballot. So what she does is she creates that organization, creates another organization in 1958 called Women Power, where now she's looking for female candidates to run. And the idea of kind of empowering women to understand their responsibility as legislators. And this is the first interracial group she created. And then she had state chapters around the country to get other women to consider that as mothers, as women, as wives, tapping into that female energy of the proto-civil rights movement. By 1967, she's the first African-American woman elected to the city council in Baltimore City. And she serves for 4 terms, and she is replaced by Kwesi and Fume, but who she mentors as well. But what she saw with that is that the idea that women could make a difference in politics because of their station in life, and it wasn't, of course, we might think it's somewhat sexist in a more modern sense, but she was saying the compassion that women have for either children or spouses or the future is far more sensitive than men in terms of, once again, the bed partners of politics and business. Those of some of us in the audience might remember 1978, the blizzard of 1978. I remember that. It was like no school for like days. It was so much fun. But it literally froze the East Coast out. And in Baltimore, people who had bills in arrears of $200 had their utilities turned off. Now, this is the coldest frozen moment in that decade, I guess, of the 70s. And so some people used alternative heating sources and fires started and people lost their lives. And as an ardent Catholic that she was, she started a fuel fund, a public-private partnership to basically help people pay their bills. Because how can you turn off someone's utilities in the middle of a storm? So this is what the ballot means. Even though she's not a suffragist per se, she's born in 1912, she's going to be that first fruits of those suffragists making sure that people got in to educate and legislate on behalf of the community. So this is what the ballot means, is these kinds of proactive elements of being legislator, being educator. And one of her co-councilwomen is a woman by the name of Senator Barbara Mikulski. You might know that name. And Senator Mikulski credits Victorine Adams for showing her how to be a female legislator in a space that was not welcoming to women. So that is the fruit of the Black suffrage movement, is the case of Victorine Adams in Redux.
Yeah. I always like to end these conversations, and I want to leave a little bit of time if people have any questions for you. I like to end them with calls to action. So for this group here, share a couple resources or books or organizations that they can support, and anything that you hope that they kind of took away from this conversation.
Well, if you haven't seen the film that is being shared, I suggest the film. I definitely say partnering with the YWCA, as you have on tonight, coming to these kinds of conversations are very helpful, because that energy does kind of breed that kind of collective responsibility, let's say. I definitely would suggest considering joining the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters have historically been that vanguard, and they are very inclusive and very clear in being nonpartisan, but consciousness raising about the civic responsibility of citizenry. So regardless of your politics, right, left, center, we need to galvanize the vote. And we need to also consider how we get that conversation intergenerationally. Because in Texas, there are persons who are World War II era persons who are not receiving at-home ballots. And that they said because the new law in Texas, the people who run the voting places can't tell them, I can't tell you you're not on the list. I can't tell you your ballot's not going to be sent out. They said even to hand someone a glass of water while they're waiting in line could have that person put in jail. So these are the kinds of inane and foolish things that are happening in Texas. You heard about Georgia, Florida. Maryland was also somewhat guilty of this earlier, to maintain a certain kind of way of thinking and a certain kind of electorate being there. So we really need to galvanize the consciousness raising. Even if they don't have a candidate they're interested, write your name in, but your voice should be heard and you should exercise that right. Because they said, I think it's in, is it Ohio or somewhere, if you don't vote in consistent elections, they just have a right to remove your name altogether. So you don't have to vote. They'll just say, oh, this person mustn't live anymore. They're off the list. And you don't know you've been removed. So these kinds of what we call extra legal measures are happening to all of us. And at some point, I didn't read George Orwell's 1984. I should read it. But the idea that we're going to move towards a society in which things are far more murky than they have been for what we've called our democracy. It's happening here. We're pointing to China, we're pointing to Russia. Some of that's happening right here. And it's not happening to us because we're living in the DMV, but it's going to eventually affect all of us. So I think we need to be very much the canaries in the cave, so to speak, to realize something foul is in the air. And before it takes all of our breaths, we should save the breath of the least of us. So that's my preaching for the day. And so I just say, join, stay informed, and talk.
Well, Ida, thank you so much for this very educational conversation. Wanted to open the floor up to anybody that may have a question. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm in the DMV. I'm DC proper, and I advocate on behalf of housing for the homeless. My question would be, could you speak a little bit about what Brian Kemp did in the state of Georgia as the Attorney General in the last election?
It's from my understanding that he was the person responsible for the election, but also a candidate for the election. So what he should have done is recuse himself or remove himself from being the principal point person to literally count the ballots for the election he's running in. So it's my understanding at the end of the film, it talks much more articulately about this, that there were, I think, either 100,000 plus votes that were or voters, excuse me, who were removed from the rolls. So he was expunging names and removing people from the list to basically pull it in his favor. Because that vote was either 35 or 40,000 vote difference in terms of his winning. So it was literally a hairline difference in terms of the election going in his favor. He should have removed himself from being in that position because it does cause double jeopardy. He chose not to remove himself, and then he also aborted or expunged people from the voting rolls in his favor. So.
I'm sorry that I joined the call a little bit late, but could you tell us again about how we see this film? I'm really struck. It's what just the pieces we've seen. This is an amazing story and film.
Yes, the film is on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
Pardon my phone ringing in the background, but Amazon Prime has the film, and they do have a 30-day complimentary if you want to see it. So, but you might be addicted. But Amazon Prime has the video.
Tysley, looks like you have a question.
I did. This has been excellent. So I thank you so much for sharing your expertise and passion with us. You know, we often hear that elections matter most at the local level. Can you just help us to better understand why it's really important at the local level to engage, and any tips you may have about motivating people to not only register, but to just actively participate?
That's a very good question. And I have to go back to Victorine Adams in terms of that, because she was on the state Senate as well, but she left that Senate seat before serving in that term to run for the city council. So the city becomes like the house in which you live. So you can concern yourself with the neighborhood, but if the house in which you live, which is your locality, is poor or rundown or inaccessible, then outside of the house makes no difference. So the local election, and I love what my former senator from Massachusetts said, his name escapes me right, O'Neill, all politics are local. So the street signs, the pay for teachers, the police on the field force, the firemen, all of that is done by local politicians. There's a conversation right now about anti-masking or masking. All that's going to be done by your local officials. And Virginia's proven very clearly that there's a lot of difference of opinion versus the governor, the state versus the actual counties or the cities. So politics on the local level really impact your life, which is the house. So if you want your house to have clean windows and, you know, floorboards are down and, you know, things work, that local election is key, because at the end of the day, no one's going to care how your house looks if you don't seem to care how your house looks. And even to trash collection and some other things that have happened in DC that were a little bit kind of questionable with Fenty in his neighborhood with snow removal and heated pools in his Y versus other people didn't have heated pools in their Y. So all of that goes down to the local level. Now, as much as people might have opinions about Marion Barry, he sought to spread the butter across the entire slice of bread to the best of his ability. And some others don't have that kind of understanding. So a little partisan there, but.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anyone else? Monica?
Sure. So, Dr. Jones, I know one of the things that people are fearing most, particularly about the upcoming elections and then the elections again in 2024, is that, you know, a lot of voters, to your point, will be demoralized or depleted and frustrated and intimidated and may not go to the polls. And, you know, and then, of course, suffer the results both at the local, state, and national level when people who don't represent them are voted into office, which, as we all know, is actually the case now in most jurisdictions around the country. But we also know that our ancestors of you know, both in terms of women and people of color, had to overcome greater barriers. And so when you look at something like, you know, a state passing a legislation that says, you know, we've taken you from the rolls, we're not going to tell you, or you can get arrested for giving someone a bottle of water, you know, it makes people feel a little bit intimidated, but not nearly as intimidated as you have shared when you have people who are threatening the lives of people who are voting. So what are some strategies that we can share with people who may be feeling intimidated, but also some strategies for people who want to help? You know, like I have some young people who I mentor, and a couple of them were so outraged at what some of the things that went on with the elections in Georgia and Florida, that they said things like, well, I'm going to fill my car up with bottled water for the 2022 elections, and I'm going to drive to Georgia and just pass it out near the polls or something. You know, so people are trying to come up with like a strategy for helping, but they really don't know what to do. So there's some things that we can do. One, to encourage people to go to the polls and not feel intimidated. And then two, effective strategies for people who really want to help in parts of the country where extraordinarily intentional efforts at disenfranchisement are underway.
That's a great question. I know that I think in Pennsylvania as well as Georgia, I know a number of people, and when Obama ran, one of my friends went down to Virginia to do the door knocking. So the idea of kind of doing something physical is huge for people because they actually feel like they're engaged in some movement. And I think there's a lot of thirst for kind of the movements of the 20th century. People want to be part of that movement, whether it's the Malcolm movement or the Martin movement or SNCC or what have you. So I get that. And I think there are organizations on the ground in those states that are doing that kind of work. I mean, she has her Fair Fight campaign that Stacey Abrams is running. So there are organizations they can join. For those of us who are a little bit less physical, there's always check writing. They need money for these things. So there's ways in which you can, and then for those of us who might have a spiritual bent, there's prayers you can give. So depending upon your level of agency and your level of engagement, you can give accordingly. I think the young people that are interested who might have that kind of, I have to get up and do something, that's a great idea. So they should coordinate their efforts so they're not duplicating or undermining efforts, but it's very good to be in synergy and harmony. So I think the idea that people might be kind of in a situation and you are well-intentioned in wanting to help, might be better to be informed with your helping than just simply randomly coming down. I get the idea of the kind of urgency where it's kind of fire under your bum and you've got to just jump up and do. But we should be more intentional, because the adversary or the enemy of this, or let's say those contrary to us wanting our freedoms to be expressed or our democracy secure, are very intentional about the ways in which they're operating. It's not slapdash. It's very intentional. It's using courts, systems, and other things. They could even do a teaching at an elementary school or teaching at a high school. For those of us who are 18 and over, who have the quote franchise, teaching younger people about that understanding, so they can understand the three branches of government, how the three branches of government interact with one another, or how they're supposed to interact with one another. How is public discourse to be had? How you disagree, how you disagree agreeably. So some of these conversations can be had in just creating a more conscious citizenry as well. So sometimes going to the front lines to want to do that battle, if they're led, I would definitely say go with an intentional understanding and connect, so that you're harmonizing with those people on the ground versus imposing an external view on those people down there or wherever you choose to go. But then also locally right here, to have these teach-ins amongst yourself, intergenerational conversations amongst yourselves on what that looks like here. Because as we heard Mr. Harvey talk about issues about homelessness, there are a number of shelters in DC that have closed. So and they're taken up by developers. So our fire might not be blazing like Georgia or Texas, but there's some smoke in DC. There are some embers burning in DC that need to be addressed here locally. So some of these things can be actually looked at locally in terms of what is peripheral to what might be happening in a Florida, Texas, Georgia, Ohio, where have you. So that's also another way to be, once again, intentional and informed, and then make a plan of action. I know there's a lot for a millennial because they like to press the button to see it move. But for those of us from analog times with TVs that had dials, we might understand that a bit more, but it's just the way how we learn and think.
And it good wrap up with, all politics are local. So see what you can do to help your neighbor, and also meet people where they are. That's what I take away from that. Well, it's been a lovely time with everyone today. I will, as always, after this conversation, I will send out a recording of this. And also, I know Dr. Jones mentioned a lot of names and people and history, and I will try to capture some of that and share with you all so you can share with your communities. As always, the spring at the YWCA National Capital Area is a busy time, and we have lots of opportunities in the next few months to engage with us in these really important conversations. First up is our Women's History Month event, which is in a month from today. And we are cautiously, hopefully, very excited to be back in person and in community for that event. It's called Always on the Front Lines, Women and Their Roles in Times of Crisis. So very excited for that upcoming courageous conversation. We also have two major campaigns happening in April. One is our Stand Against Racism Challenge, which is a 21-day racial equity education challenge that you will have assignments during the week for 21 days. Our registration is open now. It begins on April the 4th. So please go to our website and sign up for that and tell your friends. Space is limited, so join us. I'm very excited to be able to host that this year. We also, if you've been around with us for a while, we are going to be back on Freedom Plaza on Saturday, April the 23rd for Stand Against Racism rally. It's hopefully be a beautiful spring day where we can make our voices heard in big fashion. So that will be starting at noon on April the 23rd. All of these events, we just popped in the chat. There's RSVP links, so take a minute and do that. You can also check out our website and our event page. They're also linked there. As always, we work really hard here at the YWCA, and if you are so inclined to give donations, you can do that on our website at ywcanca.org/donate now. We appreciate all of your time this evening. Hope to see all your faces in March and April. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
You too.